as we are here together and we are ready for Adult Sunday School this morning, making sense of the Bible, understanding the Bible as we're working our way through that particular Adam Hamilton study. And just want to make sure that, okay, yeah, my screen is working here because sometimes we get a glitch in terms of our Wi-Fi here at the church, and I am at the church now this morning, back in the office. I'll be getting my COVID shot, first one, here later on this afternoon. And wouldn't you know it, the fan that I am of the NCAA men's basketball tournament, and my vaccination is at 4:45. And the show that is the selection show that tells you where everybody is going to be in the brackets is at 5 o'clock. So, well, we'll just have to make do because sometimes some things do take precedence over the NCAA tournament. So, actually, I was really excited yesterday when, first of all, my Ohio State Buckeyes beat Michigan. That's always a good thing. But what I was thinking was that the game after that was Iowa playing Illinois. And I was envisioning today a game between Ohio State and Iowa for the Big Ten Tournament Championship. But, Hawkeyes, you blew it again. So, maybe they'll meet in the NCAA tournament, but I doubt it. Two Big Ten teams, they'll probably seed them in different brackets. But anyway, it's always a fun time of year for me. I look forward to the tournament, and I'm excited because last year we didn't have it because of COVID. So it's great to have things getting back to normal. Now, where are we in our study here? We are now going to look at, as we're making sense of the Bible and as we're trying to do hermeneutics in responsible interpretation of the Scripture. We dealt with the gay issue the last two Sundays. Now we're going to deal with the book of Revelation. Well, why is that? Well, every place I've ever served, well, just about, not quite every, but almost every place I've ever served, certainly every place in Iowa, with the exception now of Nevada, I ask people, what would you like to do as far as Bible study is concerned? Is there a particular part of the Bible that you would like to look at? And invariably, without exception, people say, let's study the book of Revelation. And I try to restrain myself from rolling my eyes and shrugging my shoulders, but because I know the reason why a lot of people want to look at Revelation. And that is because of the idea behind the book of Revelation that still exists in the church today. Let me go back a little bit. When I was in Bible college, 1969 to 1973, that was during that time frame, a guy by the name of Hal Lindsey wrote Late Great Planet Earth, which was his particular take on what we call eschatology or end time theology of the end times. And he came out of a very strong particular theological point of view, which is conservative, fundamental, dispensationalist, Dallas Theological Seminary, which is very Southern Baptist. Now, nothing against that. I'm just saying that is the theological framework that he was coming out of. And he took his means and way of interpreting the book of Revelation, as has been others after him, like Tim LaHaye in the Left Behind series, for example. They have, what's the best word to use here? Spectacularized the whole idea of the end times and have taken the visions of John and have tried to give them at that time 20th century definitions and meanings. Today it would be 21st century definitions and meanings, focusing upon the rapture, upon the millennium, those kinds of things. Now, when you study the book of Revelation, especially if you study it with conservative groups, those are terms that you're going to hear. Questions will be asked like, when does the rapture occur? The rapture, by the way, is the taking out of Christians out of this world. Some people believe that the church will be taken out before the end times start. Those are called pre-rapture. Some believe that the church will be taken out in the middle of the great persecution, which is, the persecution of the church in the world by the ascension of the beast and the Antichrist. There are those then who also believe that the church will be taken out at the very end, post-rapture. And there are those who talk about when will the millennium occur, which is the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and where does everything. So you'll hear terms like premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial, midmillennial. Those are terms, and the average person who may not be real familiar with those things or may not have read Tim LaHaye's series Left Behind, which is basically about the rapture happening before the great persecution begins and as the Antichrist arises, and people who got left behind. In fact, I remember, again, back in my Bible college days, I believe it was my freshman year. Would have been late 1969, maybe early 1970. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Anyway, back then, 69, 73, and through the 70s, into the 80s, there was this big following and surge of interest in end-time theology, eschatology, the book of Revelation. And we had Spiritual Emphasis Week in the fall and in the spring every year. And we had speakers that were coming in and they were preaching about this, talking about it. One going so far as to say that the Lord was coming back. It's about the second coming of Christ. Was coming back in 1982. I mean, he was so bold that he put a year, date on it. And Jesus has something to say about that when the disciples asked him in the book of Acts, Lord, when are you coming back to establish your kingdom? And he said, I don't even know. Only the Father knows, and he hasn't told me, which is a pretty incredible statement. So if somebody else comes along and says, he's coming back this time, well, Jesus didn't even know, so how can you know? Anyway, back then, one of the first really big Christian rock artists was a guy by the name of Larry Norman. And our Bible college did not approve of Christian rock. We were singing the old hymns, and even if the collegians, which was the school youth ensemble singing group, even when they up-templed stuff a little bit, it was kind of viewed with a jaundiced eye. But Larry Norman was one of the first Christian rock artists, came out before Petra and all the rest. He had been in a rock band. He looked like he'd been in a rock band. He had the long, shaggy hair and everything. Remember, this is 69, 70. And we had an opportunity to get him for a concert at the college because he was going through the area and he would do it cheap. And the founding fathers of the school told us that, well, okay, but you need to tell him to tone it down. And we went and we told him, come on in and have at it, do your thing, and that's what he did. And sometimes it's easier to ask forgiveness than it is to ask permission. And but one of his songs, first interesting Christian rock songs, was the song "You've Been Left Behind," and I believe that was his song. At least he sang it in that concert, and I believe it was his song. But it was talking about the rapture, the taking out of the church from the world, and Christians being taken out, and you've been left behind because you're a non-Christian. And it was an interesting song. And because we were cutting our theological teeth in that genre, It made sense to us. We understood it. Within Christian groups, that song became quite popular back then, but it's all a reflection of a basic conservative understanding of the book of Revelation and of end time theology, eschatology. Eschaton is the Greek word which means end times, very simply put. So, however, I don't read the book of Revelation that way. And I think it is irresponsible hermeneutics to sensationalize, that's the word I wanted before, the whole idea behind Revelation. I take it from more of a historical perspective rather than a eschatological perspective. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. If you read the first chapter of Revelation, verse 4, you see who it's addressed to, and that's significant. It's addressed to 7 churches that still exist today, that exist in Turkey, in the southwestern part of the country. The churches of Pergamon, Thyatira, Philadelphia, Sardis, Smyrna, Ephesus, and Laodicea. And there is a message there in the opening chapters that is specific to each one of those churches. Now, it is evident that the writer knows, most likely on a personal level, knows these churches. And some of them he is trying to encourage them, but several of them are getting a real stern warning. They're getting a real hard talking to. They're literally being taken out back behind the woodshed, and they're given a whacking. Is what happens. Ephesus is told that you have lost your first love. In other words, they are becoming spiritually cold. They don't have that passion that they originally had. They thought what was going on, that the church of Ephesus thought they were being open-minded by tolerating groups that were embracing pagan culture. And that's not surprising at Ephesus, because being the center of the Temple of Diana and the worship of Diana, Artemis, in Roman culture, Diana in the Greek gods, that would be common to have that type of thing. And apparently, instead of standing strong against pagan worship and culture, because part of the pagan worship rites to worship Diana was that the priests and the priestesses of the temple also served as prostitutes, because that was part of the ritual. By joining to the priest or priestess, you were joining to the god, securing the god's blessing. So, and apparently, the church at Ephesus thought that they were being extremely tolerant by embracing that and probably other aspects of pagan culture. And they are told, this is not good. And so they are warned about that. The church at Smyrna is being persecuted by the Jews in the local synagogue. And Christian Jews are being expelled from the synagogue. And so the writer is trying to encourage them. So you see, the writer is familiar with the local situations. Pergamon was the center of the worship of Zeus, the Greek god, Roman god Zeus. And there was a massive altar there in Pergamon, which had been preserved. And in fact, you can still see it today. It's in a German museum. And John refers to it as the throne of Satan. And at least that's what we think that he's referring to there. And here too, people are also participating in emperor worship. See, the Roman Empire at that time thought itself to be extremely tolerant. They would allow just about any other kind of worship as long as you took and burned your pinch of incense every year as a worship of the emperor, which basically was declaring that you were a good Roman citizen. You acknowledged the deity citizenship of the Roman emperor and that you were a loyal Roman citizen. If you did not do that, you would be persecuted. You would not be able, in some places, the level of persecution varied from one area to another, but in some areas where it was quite fierce, you would not be allowed to buy or sell. You would be basically become a persona non grata within your community. So Pergamon is warned about that. Thyatira, there's a woman there who was teaching, and the fact that it was a woman was okay, but she was talking and teaching that it was okay to eat meat that was sacrificed to pagan gods. That was a real issue in the early church because most of the meat that was consumed was butchered and offered as a sacrifice to the gods, and a portion of it would be given to the temple as an offering and also to help support the priests and priestesses there. But that was a real issue, was is this stuff clean or unclean because it's been sacrificed in the worship of other gods, false gods, pagan gods. Sardis had a reputation of a church that had a really vibrant faith, a really alive place. But John says their faith is empty and they have soiled themselves in the world. Now, what exactly he meant by that, we're not sure, but apparently their faith was all for show. It was all show, no go. Philadelphia is encouraged because they're being harassed by the local Jewish population. And Laodicea had become lukewarm in their faith. They knew the form, but not the power thereof. And John says that Jesus is going to spit them out of his mouth because lukewarm is just so disgusting. It's neither hot, it's neither cold. You're trying to vacillate in between, and you either need to commit yourself one way or the other. To know the form of religion but not the power of the religion is simply not acceptable. It's not where you're supposed to be doing. So, at that point in time, then, we digress. John, in the book of Revelation, before the message to the churches, describes his situation that he is there on Patmos, the island of Patmos. He's in exile. And he receives this vision. He is caught up into heaven by the Spirit. And that is where he sees these things. Now, the problems at hand is that you had, the church was facing in those days. Number one was compromise. They were constantly, if they weren't being assailed by the local Jewish population, they were being assailed by the Roman authorities. And so they were being forced to compromise in many situations. In other words, be able to avoid persecution. And so that's one of the things that John is hitting at them back in. Do not compromise. Do not compromise. Remain faithful, even in the face of adversity. Now, the visions that John goes on to describe, I do not think are meant to tell 21st century Christians about what the end of days is going to be like. Do I believe that there will be an end of days? Yes. Do I believe that Jesus Christ will return in the flesh to establish his kingdom on earth? Yes, I do. But do I believe that it's going to be in the terms of what we see in the book of Revelation? No. I believe the intent of the book of Revelation is to encourage first century Christians who are living in southwest Turkey, to encourage them to stop conforming to the world and the culture that's there around them, and to avoid anything that smacked of emperor worship or Roman gods, Greek gods. And even if their decisions to honor Christ were costly to them, they would be okay in the end. Rome would be defeated and God's kingdom would prevail. And we've seen that. God's kingdom has prevailed. Now, in order to convey this particular message, John uses a form of writing that was common in his day, and it's called apocalyptic writing. And it uses visions and images, and it simply was not intended to be taken literally. I don't think that Revelation is intended to be taken literally. Now, those people who are of a conservative, especially fundamentalistic point of view, want to take it literally. They want it to be, the visions that appear in Revelation are futuristic, that they are predictive of things that are going to happen in the end of days. And they're constantly caught up in saying, well, is it now? Is this the Antichrist? Is this the beast? And they're constantly looking at culture that way. And I think that is just totally off the mark in terms of what God would have for us. So I believe that Revelation, and one of the things that shows that is that Revelation was one of the last books to make it into the New Testament canon for many years. It was looked askance upon. The great reformers, John Calvin, did not like Revelation. Martin Luther did not like Revelation. So, in Revelation 17, there is the description there of the great whore of Babylon who is drunk with the blood of the saints, and the great whore of Babylon is sitting upon the beast. Now, there are several ways of understanding that imagery, and I'm just using this one as an example. But this, to me, sounds like the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire at that time, if this was during the time of Nero, Nero was very much persecuting the church. Nero was a horrible person who sought to, when Rome burned or anything else happened that went wrong, he sought to blame it upon Christianity. And he would do things, he was one of the ones who instituted Christians being thrown to the lions in the Colosseum, using Christians, crucifying Christians, but before they crucified them, they would dip them in pitch, and they would set them on fire, and they would scatter the crosses in around his gardens during parties to serve as lanterns, as illumination. Now, how horrible is that? Well, that's just the kind of person that Nero was, and that's the kind of nasty stuff that he did. That's the kind of stuff that the church was facing back then. So that, a lot of the imagery there, I think, to me, is speaking of that kind of thing. Now, so is everything in Revelation a one-to-one comparison? No, there are a variety of forms and function. John's form, John is older, if assuming that this is John, the beloved disciple, and tradition says it is. He is older at this point when John writes his epistles, which are at the end of the New Testament canon. Those are, while they are profound in other ways, they're rather simple. John got to be towards the end of his days. He was unable to walk, and they would carry him into church. And basically his message would be love one another, which is good, which is an extremely important idea. But so if John is older, and he would have to be, if he's the writer of this, his form, his methodology, his function is extremely fluid. It changes. If you've ever tried to read the book of Revelation, you're probably scratching your head, and you're trying to keep up with the imagery, and you're going, holy cow. Pablo Picasso, back in 1937, drew a pen and ink comic strip. Can you believe that? Called The Dreams and Lies of Franco, who was the King of Spain. The images, as you can imagine, Picasso, were grotesque, weird, definitely open to multiple interpretations, but it was clear that they were intended as a protest against the policies and the actions and the general megalomania of Franco. And I think that's how apocalyptic literature operates. It can be grotesque, it can be wild, it can be weird, and open, I believe, also to multiple interpretations and understandings. Now, there are four basic schools of thought as to how to read and interpret the book of Revelation. And we need to look at all four of them real quick. First of all, is what's called the futuristic aspect of it. This has developed over the last 150 years. This is kind of a Johnny come lately, and it's the favorite of TV preachers and writers like Hal Lindsey and Tim LaHaye, who I mentioned earlier. And this approach believes that everything in the book of Revelation is pointing to the future. It's pointing to the events of the last days before the second coming of Christ. And these people draw really elaborate timelines as to what they think will happen, when it will happen, who will be the primary players of the whole thing. And most of these folks believe that we are living in the end days right now. I can remember back when Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State, it was a real common thing for people to say, Henry Kissinger is the Antichrist. Can see it. He's a Jew, and and they would go on and on. They had developed these elaborate thought forms and ideas and timelines, and you know what? It wasn't the case. 1982 came and went, as the one guy back in my college days said, and Jesus didn't return. If you want to go back into the 1840s, there was a guy by the name of Miller in upstate New York who did a bunch of thinking and doodling with timelines in the book of Revelation, and he decided as to when the Lord was going to return. It was going to be within that year, in the month of April, first part of April, and he garnered a following, several hundred people, and all of them sold everything they had, put on white robes, gathered on a hilltop, and waited for the Lord to come. Well, after a couple of weeks, the Lord hadn't returned. He did some quick recalculating and said, no, it's going to happen the first 2 weeks of next month. So they hung around, they waited, and the Lord didn't return. Well, most of people drifted away, but not all of them. That became the start of a group of people known as the Millerites, who eventually would become the Seventh-day Adventists. So you see, this whole thinking of the Lord's going to return any time now has been around for a long, not a real long time, because as I said, it's a rather early development in terms of a structured theology within the church. The second way of looking at it is the historical view. In other words, that believes that Revelation is telling the future starting with John's time. So each vision is about a time to come, starting at around 95 AD, because that's when we think Revelation was probably written. Chapters 6, 7, and 8, if you want to look at Revelation, are said to describe the decline of the Roman Empire and the spread of Christianity. Chapter 9 is thought to describe the rise of Islam. Chapter 10 is about the Protestant Reformation. This was a very commonly held view by the church up till the early 1800s. So that's the historical view. Now, there's the third view that is common, is what's called the preterist view. In other words, preterist means past. This view holds that most of the events in the book of Revelation are pertaining to people and places and events that occurred back in the time of John, as it was being written. The events are all talking about things that have already happened in the Roman Empire in the late first and early second centuries. And this is still a fairly common view today. A lot of mainline churches will hold to this, and and actually there are some evangelical conservative scholars that also hold to this. Elton Ladd, who's no longer with us, but was a great New Testament scholar, held pretty much to this view. And the fourth view is what's called the idealist. That sees the book of Revelation as describing an epic, perpetual struggle between good and evil on a cosmic level and on a local level, or the challenge of living for God in a pagan culture in pagan times, and the hope that God offers to all who are persecuted for remaining faithful. Now, I have owned, and studied more commentaries on the book of Revelation than probably just about any other book of the Bible. Now, that does not make me a scholar or an authority. It just means I've waded into the water for a considerable amount of time. And I've also gotten rid of a lot of commentaries on the book of Revelation over the years, as I have called my library. And, ministers do that after a while. You realize that this doesn't really fit anymore. And so it's like culling the herd, culling your library, and getting rid of things that you're not using or interested in anymore. And when I have done that, those have been amongst the first to go. Now, many of the foremost scholars, though, that I have read over the years hold a combination of the preterist and the idealist view. And this is a sharp contrast to what most evangelists and conservative preachers who favor the futuristic view. So, some helpful books today if you want to read more on this. Warren Carter, What Does Revelation Reveal? And a favorite writer, scholar of mine, Bruce Metzger, Break the Code, is also an interesting and a good book. So what I'd like to do, and I'm going to do this next week, and this is a good place for us to stop on this particular study. I want to take a brief walk through the book of Revelation and try to see it as the original recipients would have seen it, because that's always, for responsible hermeneutics, responsible interpretation of the Bible, that is always the first question you need to ask. What is this saying to the original recipients? The book to the Philippians was sent and written to the Philippian church, the people there. So what is that saying to them? What was the intent for them? And the same thing now is true also for the book of Revelation. It's being written and intended for specific churches. So what does that say? What is it saying to them and for them? And then after you get past that, then you can begin to see and understand what it has to say for us. And that's where we'll pick things up next time as we try to continue to make sense of the Bible, understand the Bible. So, thanks for stopping by this morning for Bible study and Sunday school class, and hope you have a good day, great day. May the Lord bless you real good.